Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be tackling a question that honestly has been around forever.
Right.
Would the world be more peaceful if more women were in charge?
Hmm.
And I got to say, we've got a ton of sources to go through.
Oh.
We've got academic research, we've
Mhm.
got historical examples, and even public opinion polls.
Really interesting stuff.
And we're not going to tell you what to think.
No.
We're just going to lay it all out there and let you decide.
For sure.
And I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting
Yeah.
because we really get to go into these topics.
Absolutely.
So first things first, women leading countries. It's been pretty rare historically.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, shockingly rare. Research from Columbia Business School found that between 1950 and 2004, less than 4% of national leaders were women.
Wow. That's a tiny number.
It is a tiny number, but I will say that things are shifting.
Okay.
Parliamentary representation for women is growing globally.
And as of 2017, it sits at a worldwide average of 23.3%.
Okay, that's a lot more data to work with.
Yeah, it gives us a lot more to work with as we examine the impact of women in leadership roles.
So let's jump into the debate.
Let's do it.
Does having more women in charge actually lead to a more peaceful world?
Right.
On the one hand, you've got examples of women leaders who have been hailed as peacemakers.
Yeah.
Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand.
Uh-huh.
She received international praise for her empathetic leadership after the Christchurch mosque shootings.
Yes.
And during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
So she's definitely someone who people look to as a peacemaker.
Sure. And then you have Angela Merkel in Germany.
Yeah.
She was seen as a steady hand during the European migrant crisis
Okay.
and during various economic upheavals.
Yeah, she was chancellor for a long time.
She was there for quite a while.
And her approach to leadership often prioritized diplomacy and collaboration.
Yeah, she was very much into working things out.
Okay, and we can't forget figures like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia,
Oh, absolutely.
who won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work on peace building and rebuilding her country after years of civil war.
I mean, that's amazing work.
And Gro Harlem Brundtland in Norway,
Yes.
who was a tireless advocate for sustainable development and global health cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
So these are just a few examples of women who have led with a focus on peace and diplomacy.
You know what's interesting is that
What's that?
these examples actually highlight the limitations of trying to make broad generalizations about women in leadership.
Okay, what do you mean?
I mean, there's this tendency to essentialize gender,
Okay.
to assume that all women share inherent qualities.
They'll all act the same.
Yeah, or they'll behave in predictable ways.
Gotcha.
But in reality, like their male counterparts, women leaders are incredibly diverse.
Of course.
They're influenced by their political contexts, their personal histories,
Right.
societal pressures. It's a very complex mix.
It's not just about being a woman.
No, definitely not.
Okay, so on the peacemaker side, we've got Ardern Merkel, Sirleaf Brundtland.
Right.
But history also gives us plenty of examples of women leaders who took a more,
Yeah,
shall we say, assertive approach.
definitely.
Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Iron Lady, led her country into the Falklands War.
Yep. And Goldie Meir, Israel's first female prime minister,
Right.
dealt with multiple military crises during her time in office.
And how about Indira Gandhi in India?
Yes, she adopted a very assertive stance during the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War.
So it's not just modern history.
No, not at all.
There's a fascinating study by Dubé and Harouche looking at European monarchs between 1480 and 1913.
Wow.
And they found that those ruled by queens were actually 27% more likely to engage in conflict than those ruled by kings. So that's a pretty significant difference.
It is, but it's important to remember what I mentioned earlier about essentializing gender.
Right.
Just as we shouldn't assume that women leaders are inherently peaceful, we can't assume they're inherently more prone to conflict either. There's a danger in trying to fit complex historical figures into neat categories.
It's not black and white.
No, it's definitely not.
It's important to consider the context, the individual personalities, the specific political pressures that each leader faced.
For sure.
We're dealing with individuals, not stereotypes.
Exactly. And as anthropologist Catherine Panderbrick has pointed out,
Yeah.
the sample size of women leaders throughout history is still relatively small. It's difficult to draw definitive conclusions when we're working with limited data.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got these contrasting examples,
Yeah.
these dueling narratives about women leaders being either peacemakers or warmongers.
It's tricky.
Where do we go from here?
Well,
How do we make sense of it all?
perhaps instead of focusing solely on individual leaders, we need to shift our attention to the broader impact of women's representation in politics.
Okay, so you mean looking at what happens when you have more women in parliaments,
Yes.
in government positions,
Uh-huh.
rather than just focusing on who's at the very top?
Precisely. And when we do that,
Yeah.
some really interesting patterns emerge.
Such as?
Well, for instance, research by Caprioli has found that a 5% increase in the proportion of women parliamentarians
Okay.
correlates with a country being 5 times less likely to use violence in international crises.
Wow. That's a pretty striking correlation.
It is.
So it's not just about having a woman as president or prime minister.
Right.
It's about having more women involved in the decision-making process overall.
That seems to be the case.
Interesting.
And this raises some fascinating questions about how the presence of women in these spaces might be influencing conflict resolution strategies.
So how is it that women are influencing things just by being there?
Well, one theory is that women bring different communication styles and priorities to the table.
Okay.
There's a lot of research suggesting that women tend to be more collaborative and consensus-oriented in their approach to decision-making,
Okay.
which could have a real impact on how countries navigate complex international situations.
So are we talking about women being less likely to jump to military solutions,
Yeah.
more focused on diplomacy
Exactly.
and finding common ground?
It's not about painting women as pacifists,
Right.
but about recognizing that their presence can shift the dynamics of power
Okay.
and influence the range of options considered when conflicts arise.
This makes me think about those stereotypes we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
About women being inherently more peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is.
On the one hand, it feeds into this idea that women are somehow better suited to resolving conflicts peacefully.
Right.
But on the other hand, it can actually put pressure on them
Oh, yeah.
to conform to that expectation,
Totally.
which can be really limiting.
Absolutely. And it can backfire in a big way.
How so?
If a woman leader doesn't act according to these preconceived notions of femininity,
Yeah.
she can be labeled as too aggressive or even unwomanly,
Right.
which can damage her credibility and her ability to lead effectively.
It's like they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Exactly.
If they take a strong stance on national security, they're seen as betraying their feminine nature.
Right.
But if they prioritize diplomacy and cooperation,
Yeah.
they risk being perceived as weak or naive on the world stage?
It's a real catch-22.
It is.
And unfortunately, this pressure to conform to gender stereotypes can actually push women leaders to act more aggressively
Oh, wow.
than they might otherwise,
Really?
almost as a way of overcompensating for these perceived vulnerabilities.
Wow. I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is.
Society expects women to be peaceful, so when they deviate from that expectation, they're judged more harshly, which then forces them to double down on proving their strength.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
And we see this reflected in the polling data you mentioned earlier.
All right.
Even though studies have shown that women are generally more opposed to military intervention than men, there's still a widespread perception, both in the U.S. and globally, that men are better suited to lead during times of conflict or crisis.
That's so interesting. So even though the data might suggest one thing, these deeply ingrained biases continue to influence how people perceive women leaders,
Yeah,
particularly when it comes to issues of national security.
exactly. And for women leaders themselves,
Yeah,
this creates a constant pressure to walk a tightrope.
I see.
They have to balance their own beliefs and leadership styles with the expectations of a society that often judges them through a very gendered lens.
So if even well-intentioned women leaders are subject to these pressures,
Right.
does that mean the hope for a more peaceful world is just a pipe dream?
Not at all.
Okay.
But it does mean we need to be realistic about the complexities involved.
Okay.
Increasing the number of women in power isn't a magic bullet solution.
Right.
It's not going to automatically transform the world into a utopia of peace and harmony.
So if we're moving beyond simple answers, what are some of the things we need to be thinking about to really shift the needle on peace and security?
Well, for one, we need to challenge those harmful gender stereotypes head on.
Okay.
The idea that women are somehow less capable of handling complex foreign policy issues,
Yeah.
or that they're inherently more pacifistic, is simply not supported by the evidence.
You know, it reminds me of how the terms hawkish and dovish are used in politics.
Uh-huh.
Hawkish meaning advocating for military solutions.
Right.
And dovish meaning favoring diplomacy. It's almost like there's this assumption that women should naturally fall into the dovish camp.
Yeah.
Which completely ignores the diversity of perspectives and experiences that women bring to the table.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that leadership is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor.
Right.
And frankly, the world needs more than just hawks and doves.
For sure.
We need leaders who are capable of nuanced thinking, of adapting to different situations, of drawing on a range of approaches to solve complex problems.
And that's where having diverse voices, including those of women, becomes so crucial.
Absolutely.
It's not about saying that women are better than men at peacemaking,
Right.
but about recognizing that they bring unique perspectives, priorities, and experiences to the table.
Precisely. It's about expanding the range of possibilities, creating a richer and more dynamic conversation around how we approach conflict, security, and ultimately the very nature of peace itself.
So how do we make that happen?
Wow.
How do we ensure that women not only have a seat at the table, but that their voices are truly heard and valued?
Well, it's not just about getting more women elected to office, although that's certainly a crucial part of the equation.
Right.
It's also about addressing the systemic barriers that prevent women from even getting to that point in the first place.
We're talking about things like discrimination.
Yes.
Lack of access to education and resources, the unequal burden of caregiving responsibilities.
Right.
These are all factors that can make it incredibly difficult for women to pursue leadership roles.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual women overcoming these obstacles.
Okay.
It's about creating a societal shift that values and supports women's leadership at all levels.
It's about changing the narrative.
Yes.
Challenging those ingrained biases and creating a more equitable playing field where women have a genuine opportunity to lead and make their mark on the world.
And that's where you, the listener, come in.
Okay.
Because ultimately, this isn't just an academic debate. It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
Yeah.
It's about how we treat each other, how we value different perspectives, how we approach the complex challenges facing humanity.
So we're not just asking you to listen to this deep dive.
No?
We're asking you to engage with it.
Yes.
To think critically about your own assumptions.
For sure.
To challenge those around you and to be an active participant in creating a more just and peaceful world.
Absolutely. And speaking of creating a more just world, there's another really interesting aspect of this research that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, really? What's that?
It has to do with the impact of women in parliament on government spending.
Okay.
Research by Shapiro and Mahajan found that higher female representation is often correlated with less spending on the military and more investment in social programs like healthcare and education.
Hold on, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So not only might female representation be linked to a lower likelihood of resorting to violence in international crises, but it could also be influencing how countries allocate their resources domestically.
Exactly.
Okay.
It suggests that having more women involved in budgetary decisions could lead to a shift in national priorities, away from militarism and towards a greater focus on human well-being.
Wow, imagine the possibilities if that trend continued on a global scale.
Yeah.
Instead of pouring trillions of dollars into weapons and warfare,
Right.
what if we invested those resources in tackling poverty, inequality, and the root causes of conflict?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
What would a world look like if peace and human security were truly at the heart of our political and economic systems?
Yeah. Would we even recognize it?
It's hard to say.
I mean, it wouldn't be a utopia, of course.
Yeah.
There will always be disagreements and conflicts.
Of course.
But perhaps the way we approach those conflicts, the tools we use to resolve them,
Yeah.
could fundamentally change.
It's possible.
You know, it's funny, we started this deep dive by asking whether women leaders are more peaceful.
Right.
But as we've dug into the research and explored all these different angles, it's become clear that the question itself might be too simplistic.
I agree. It's not about fitting women leaders into a neat box of peaceful or aggressive.
Right.
It's about recognizing the complexity of the issue, the myriad factors that influence leadership,
Yeah.
and the potential for greater female representation to shift the very dynamics of power and decision-making on a global scale.
So instead of trying to determine whether women are better or worse at leading,
Right.
maybe the real focus should be on achieving balance. Because when we have diverse voices and perspectives at the table, When both men and women are equally empowered to contribute their talents and insights,
Yes.
that's when we have the best chance of finding creative and sustainable solutions to the challenges facing humanity.
I think that's a great point.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we need to keep asking these tough questions.
Okay.
If this shift towards greater female representation does indeed lead to a paradigm shift in how we approach peace and security, what might those changes look like in practice?
What would a foreign policy look like if it were truly designed with the goal of preventing conflict and promoting human flourishing?
Would we see a greater emphasis on diplomacy, conflict resolution, and addressing the root causes of violence?
And would countries be more willing to invest in international cooperation and global governance structures?
Yeah, and maybe even reevaluate the whole notion that military strength is the ultimate measure of a nation's power.
These are big questions, but they're important ones.
They are, and it's a conversation that we all need to be part of regardless of our gender.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Yes.
Dive into the sources we've discussed, challenge your own assumptions, and think critically about the role that gender plays in shaping the world around us.
Because ultimately, the pursuit of peace is not a women's issue or a man's issue.
Right.
It's a human issue, and it requires all of us to be engaged, informed, and willing to work together to create a future where peace is not just a dream, but a reality.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.